The puppets of Krat turned into murderous devils overnight. This event became known as the Puppet Frenzy. Barely anyone survived, and it's up to you to save the ones who did. Playing as Geppetto's puppet, you must fight your way through many different areas, defeating well-crafted bosses along the way. Heavily inspired by the classic tale of Pinocchio and FromSoftware's Souls games, which, just to put out there, I have beaten 4 of them, the developers of Lies of P, NeoWiz, emulate but also expand upon the gameplay, trying to make a fresh experience in the process. The Souls genre has a simple yet effective approach to combat. Lies of P has everything a Souls-like should have, and then adds new and unique ideas to make the combat stand out. For starters, all the basic mechanics are there. Healing flasks, which are called pulse cells this time, a stamina bar, light attack, heavy attack, charged heavy attack, block, and dodge. But Lies of P adds a plethora of interesting combat mechanics. Your character starts with a metal arm that can be swapped out with different ones to use various special moves. There's also Fable Arts, which are flashy offensive attacks that change depending on the weapon you have equipped, and then a grinder that it forces you to replenish weapon durability in the middle of a fight. 2 key mechanics I want to focus on are the perfect block and guard regain. These go hand in hand, working together during the flow of combat. To put it simply, anytime you block an enemy's attack, that damage is stored on your health bar. If you attack them back during the short time that it's stored, you will gradually recover that HP. But if you manage to perfectly time your block, then you won't take any damage at all, dealing a massive amount of stagger damage, which I'll talk about later. Guard regain stems directly from the rally system in Bloodborne. Lies of P tried making the mechanic as good as Bloodborne's version, but fell short by a little bit. In Bloodborne, the rally system works so well because there is no blocking, only dodging. When you take damage, your health is still stored, but the only way to get health back is to play aggressive and attack with every opening you get. Don't get me wrong, guard regain is pretty fun in Lies of P and became very important during boss fights, it just fell short during normal gameplay. Regardless of all that, my favorite new addition is the weapon assembly system. The way this works is almost every weapon is divided into a blade and handle. The blade part is what you upgrade to do more damage, and then the handle is the moveset for whatever combination weapon is made. Stat scaling can also be changed on the handle to work better with whatever build you are running. To do this, you must find the crank item that corresponds with the offensive stat you want to focus on. There's many ridiculous combinations, and I ended up creating a giant wrench on the end of a police baton. Having freedom to customize your playstyle goes a long way in these games, and I think Lies of P did a fantastic job at giving the players the tools to personalize the experience. Unfortunately, the experience the level design provides is kind of mundane. Firstly, Lies of P takes a very linear approach to level design. That isn't necessarily a bad thing, but the areas became very predictable and felt fairly easy to navigate. I never really got lost or had to search around for where to go next. I would immediately find the shortcuts back to checkpoints without even trying. Shortcuts should connect different sections of a level together, not just a quick jog around the block. Taking a look at Bloodborne again shows that shortcuts should be used in a way that connects the start of a level with a much later part that took a while to get to. Also, shortcuts don't always have to lead directly to checkpoints. They can take the form of an elevator or drop-off that gets you back to where you need to be a little faster than before. Lies of P just doesn't utilize branching paths effectively, and shortcuts tend to be a separate path, making them feel disconnected from the progression of a level. Another issue is the lack of freedom. Areas have to be tackled in a certain order, and since there's a lack of meaningful exploration, I lost interest in finding anything special, opting to just progress through the level instead. Exploration is a key feature within this genre, and losing some of that left me a little disappointed. Since beating Lies of P, I've watched quite a bit of content on the game. One idea that I keep seeing is that this game is harder than the FromSoftware titles. Assuming these creators have actually played the Souls games before, this take makes no sense to me. Lies of P took me around 16 hours to complete, and from what I've gathered, that is extremely fast. I wasn't rushing through the game either. By the end, I had a fully upgraded weapon, and my stats were more than sufficient to beat the game. Normal combat through levels ended up being very easy due to the aforementioned blocking and guard regain. A lot of times I would block everything the enemies would throw at me, and then attack them directly after to recover all of my health. To add on to that, most enemies die in a few hits, so they don't really pose much of a threat by themselves, and you don't need to worry about fighting more than one at a time until the later areas. The same feeling goes for the bosses as well. I opted to not use specters, which are summons that split the boss aggro, and I still didn't struggle all that much. None of the bosses took me more than a handful of tries, and I wasn't even using every combat mechanic effectively. I rarely used Fable Arts, and I never touched grindstones, which allowed you to imbue your weapon with a damage effect such as fire or acid. Regardless, Souls-like bosses don't always have to be hard to be a fun and rewarding fight, and I do think the game did a decent enough job creating a difficulty curve that slowly adds more and more challenge as the playthrough progresses. Spoiler warning, I'm going to talk about the final chapter of the game. Watch at your own risk. Everything I just mentioned stays true until the last area. In this level, the game likes to spam enemies at you and stations a boatload of stronger ones all over the place. I wouldn't say this area is hard to navigate, but the amount of enemies is ridiculous. At different points I had to run past the mobs of enemies chasing me, find the checkpoint, and then go back and deal with them slowly. This jump in difficulty felt very out of place and left me feeling disappointed, especially since this was the last chapter of the game. Oh shit. Oh my god, dude. There's no fucking shot. Bro, what is that? It's also home to the worst difficulty jump in terms of bosses, who I will talk about shortly, adding even more reason for disappointment. Despite feeling easy, bosses weren't a disappointment overall. They consistently added interesting challenges each and every fight. The first boss of the game, Parade Master, does a fantastic job teaching you the combat. He has a lot of wide sweeping attacks that are slow enough to let you learn the perfect block timings. He also teaches fury attacks, which cause the boss to glow red and then perform a move that can't be dodged and must be perfectly blocked in order to not take damage. It also deals a good amount of stagger damage, which I mentioned earlier. Stagger points are built up by continually attacking an enemy. Charged attacks and perfectly blocking build this up faster, and when the amount of stagger damage reaches a certain threshold, the boss's health bar becomes outlined in white. Landing another charged heavy attack during this time results in the boss going down and opens them up to a fatal attack. Fatal attacks do a significant amount of damage and give you an attack window after the animation is complete. I do want to mention a missed opportunity here. For some reason, the amount of stagger damage is hidden from the player, taking away the ability to understand when you should be going for the attacks that'll get you to a fatal blow the fastest. What the developers should have done is add a separate white bar above or below the boss's health bar to show how much stagger damage you have accumulated. Now, the main reason I brought up the first boss is to praise how the game effectively teaches every major mechanic without overwhelming the player. In all honesty, Lies of P might do the best job of this in the entire genre. To compare this to a FromSoftware title, Elden Ring doesn't even come close to doing this effectively. The first major boss in this game, Margit, is the complete opposite of the Parade Master. Margit has a various array of long combat strings, delayed attacks, and small attack windows. He also constantly jumps away from the player, disregarding the aggressive playstyle both of these games promote. On the other hand, Lies of P keeps doing a good job of teaching the player through each and every boss fight. Now, the main critique I have with bosses is the overuse of phases. Almost every single main boss fight has 2 phases. It became very predictable to the point where I knew it was coming every single time. After a while, there was no longer that nervous feeling after depleting the first health bar. Some of the phases were actually done really well, and I just wish they switched things up to add variation among bosses. Another spoiler warning, I'm going to get into specific boss fights that happen in the mid to late game. Taking inspiration from other games is a great way to improve your game, but Lies of P has the avid FromSoftware fan in me going, I see what you did there. There's 2 major boss fights that use distinct visual and combat elements that are uncanny to the fights in FromSoftware games. One example is the final phase of the King of Puppets fight. First, the boss turns into a humanoid puppet named Romeo. Romeo attacks with a scythe, performing insane spin attacks while speeding around the arena. Then, he lights the scythe on fire and gets even faster with more intricate combos. The fight felt very similar to the Black Flame Freed fight in the Dark Souls 3 DLC. Don't get me wrong, the King of Puppets fight doesn't come close to the difficulty of Sister Freed, mainly due to the blocking mechanic, but still managed to feel extremely familiar. Another example is the second phase of the final boss, Nameless Puppet. Nameless breaks his sword in 2, giving him dual blades. Every time he swings, there is a blood flame effect that follows his swords. Lady Maria in Bloodborne does this same effect and even has a very similar moveset. None of this is to say that the developers shouldn't have done this. In fact, these are 2 of the best fights in the entire game. At first, it definitely rubbed me the wrong way, but after I thought more about Lies of P, I realized in order to make a competitive game in this genre, you are going to have to take a ton of ideas from the company who created it. NeoWiz did this, but still managed to make a fairly unique product in the process. Remember in the difficulty section of this video when I said that none of the bosses took me more than a handful of tries? That was a lie. One boss took me over 20 tries to beat, cementing herself as one of the hardest I've ever fought. That boss is none other than Laxasia the Complete. She is the spike in boss difficulty I mentioned earlier, and yes, she deserves her own section. This fight caught me completely off guard and managed to put any skill I had into question. Laxasia is an absolute beast. She has an insane amount of moves, a lot of which are put into super long combos that require mastery of the block timings to get through unharmed. She also inflicts the electric shock status ailment, which makes you take increased damage. Out of all of the bosses, she probably has the most health, and the longer you take to down her, the more likely you are to get killed. Oh, and don't you worry, this boss definitely doesn't have a second phase. Right? Projectiles, lightning fast attacks, speed like the Flash, and some of the smallest attack windows in the game. All of that mixed with being one of the best fights visually leads to a ridiculous but also fair challenge that ended up being a lot of fun. The only problem I have with Laxasia is the order of her phases. Well, not necessarily the order, but the fact that she has more health in phase 1 than phase 2. This leads to phase 1 being the longer part of the fight. In my case, the reason I died so much was because I could never make it to the second phase with barely any heals left. Want to know a way to fix this? Switch the amount of health she has in phase 2 with phase 1. This lets you get to the second phase with more healing and forces you to get better at the more enjoyable part of the fight. All in all, this fight kicked my ass a lot and felt a little out of place in terms of difficulty, but managed to give me back that feeling of overcoming something insurmountable. Visually, Lies of P can only be described in one word: beautiful. Everything you see fits and molds together into this gorgeous and immersive world. The design of enemies fit perfectly with all of the area's overall themes. There are all different kinds of puppets roaming around in the city, and then there are infected enemies once you travel outside of it. The areas themselves are filled with detail and add to the overall aesthetic. The game uses elements of steampunk with a European style and combines everything into a horror-like setting. I don't know if the horror aspect was intentional, but let me tell you, this is a terrifying game.
Oh my fucking god, holy shit, that scared me. Bro, that was actually bad. That was like worse than Outlast.
That happened to me more than I'd like to admit. Walking around the streets of Krat ended up being pretty scary and always had me on my toes. Regardless, I've always been an advocate for art style over graphics, but Lies of P delivers on both of these and is an absolute treat to your eyes. Storytelling in the Soul genre is usually done in a certain way. The game uses item descriptions and notes to create deep, interesting lore that adds mystery and room for interpretation. Lies of P's story is still mysterious and uses notes that add detail but approaches it in a much more straightforward fashion. The characters tell you the backstories to areas and where to go to stay on track. I do think the characters are pretty likable overall, and I appreciated how each character had a distinct personality. Vanini is charismatic but also full of himself. Sophia is caring but also mysterious. Antonia is just trying to enjoy her final days, and Paladina realizes that he adores her and is willing to do anything to help her. Funny enough, the only character I ended up having a problem with is Geppetto. During the playthrough, I started to realize he would eventually become a villain, but that wasn't the problem. There needed to be more hints throughout the game that he would turn evil. Other than a cutscene before the King of Puppets boss fight, I don't remember getting a single hint about Geppetto until the final chapter of the game. I wish Geppetto would have slowly started talking in a darker tone and given hints on what his agenda might have been. What we got was Geppetto treating us like a son, talking in upbeat tones until literally right before the final boss.
I believed you were a good boy, but you insist on breaking my heart.
Hearing his voice sound like that ruined the character and also ruined the ending. It felt like his entire personality changed in an instant because there wasn't any build-up for him to turn on us. I did end up looking up the different endings, and I will say the true Rise of P ending is much better. At least in this ending, Geppetto has a full circle moment and apologizes to our character, but it still feels a little forced. I don't want to go into every aspect of the plot, but basically the puppet frenzy isn't even the main problem. There are a group of alchemists that claim to be trying to help, but end up running around conducting human experiments, hence the infected enemies. If that sounds confusing, that's because it is, and I was left with many unanswered questions after completing the game. All in all, the story did a decent enough job, and at least for me, the combat and gameplay of this genre is where my enjoyment really comes from. To end this video off, I want to highly recommend this game to any FromSoftware fan. Not only that, but anyone wanting to step foot in the genre for the first time will definitely be challenged but isn't going to be disappointed. That's probably some of the highest praise I could have given this game. Becoming a good starting point for a genre you didn't even create is amazing and really gets me excited for what NeoWiz is planning next. Lies of P really proved that anything is possible in this industry, showing that anyone can create a great game regardless of the genre.